So hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Riley Argenosa, Public Programs Manager at the Staten Island Museum. We're so happy that you could be with us this afternoon. So we're here today to explore the history, learn about the process, and take a closer look at the masterful creations of Divya Anantharaman, New York City's premier taxidermist. Her work seeks to combine the demonstrative aspect of scientific presentation with the symbolic, introspective nature of art. So we're here to learn from Divya. Please welcome Divya.
Thank you so much for that intro, Colleen, and thanks everyone for being here today. I'm sorry I said Colleen, I'm seeing Colleen's name, I meant Riley. So thank you, Colleen and Riley. They've both been talking to you both. So thank you, Riley, for the intro. Thank you, Colleen, for everything else. Thank you everyone for being here today. I'm super excited to talk to you about taxidermy. It's my job, but it's also something that I really love so much. I'm super passionate about taxidermy. And I think it's such an overlooked tool for conservation and storytelling. And I'm basically going to take you through a slideshow. I'm going to share some slides with you that will go over a bit of the history of taxidermy, a bit of what taxidermy is. I'll share some of my projects with you, and I'll also kind of share just like what I love about taxidermy, and we'll do a Q&A after as well. So I'm going to get into sharing my screen here. And does everyone see that? I guess it's shown up. All right, cool. So taxidermy, right? Taxidermy, am I right? All right. So what is taxidermy? So before we get into the history and all of that, it's good to know what taxidermy is. So the roots of the word taxidermy come from the Greek taxi, which is to move or arrange, and derma, which is skin. So taxidermy as a concept is pretty simple, right? It's mounting a skin that's been cleaned and preserved onto finding the skin of an animal that's been cleaned and preserved onto an anatomically accurate form. But the execution can vary very widely, right? So each mount is very different between species and between animals and between individual animals. The only thing original to the animal is the skin. Everything else is made by a person. So even the eyes, the soft tissue detail, sometimes even the teeth and tongue. On birds, sometimes the heads and the feet are replicated or fabricated. So aside from the skin, we can be sure of any piece of taxidermy, everything else is human made. So to make an animal look even somewhat alive again, it requires a lot of understanding about anatomy, which nowadays can be easily accessed through the internet, through lots of books and videos and stuff like that. But that wasn't always the case. So you can see between these three lions, two of them are historic, one's a modern piece. The interpretation has varied so widely because of, the person who made them, what was available to them, the information that was available to them, and the types of forms inside. So on the far, or on my left, and I think maybe you can see my cursor, this one over here, this is the lion at Gripsholm Castle. This lion here, it does not look like a lion at all. It's very caricaturized, it's very cartoony. It almost looks like those heraldic imagery, that heraldic art that was popular around the time. And that's because that's what they were working with at the time. They didn't have like a glass eye factory. They didn't have anything like that. So they were really working with what they had. Whereas this lion in the middle here, this is from the 1800s, from around the Victorian era. This lion here looks a lot more realistic. The eyes are a lot better. They had a lot more study. The body shape is still a little, the back of the body here, it's still a little bit stylized, but it's very reflective of what they saw and what they were doing at the time. And of course, this lion over here, the one on my far right, looks much more realistic. This is the modern piece. And so you can see that the interpretation and information that influence taxidermy varies very, very widely. And there are also varied styles of taxidermy too. So there's naturalistic taxidermy, which is where the animal is represented in its habitat. And that's probably what we're the most familiar with going to natural history museums. It's what we see in museums. It's also what is widely depicted as hunting trophies, or just what we think of when the word taxidermy comes to mind, right? We think of an animal that looks like the animal. But there's also other styles of taxidermy, like anthropomorphic taxidermy, which was really popular in the Victorian era in England. There are artists like Walter Potter who created this piece, which is, this is just a detail from one of these pieces, but he created these really incredible dioramas and tableaus of animals doing human things. Anthropomorphic taxidermy just means animals doing human things or animals depicted doing human things. These were some bunnies in a school, which I think is just, I think it's just darling. And I think that when we kind of put animals into these human situations, there's a bit of like tongue in cheek to it. There's a bit of humor in there, and it might not be everyone's sense of humor, but I think what it does even deeper is help us question and ponder what's that line between human and animal. And it also like makes me think of like, wow, we go to school, you know, like, and animals don't go to school. So it sort of just, you know, it sort of just helps us ponder that line between what's human and what's animal. And a lot of people get enjoyment out of this style of taxidermy. Some people don't. That's okay. It's just a style of taxidermy that exists. It has existed for a very long time. Another style that's sort of a variation of naturalistic taxidermy are fantasy creatures. People are very familiar with the jackalope, which is right in the center over there. But there are also other styles of kind of these hybrid animals that were created. Not always created just for fun. Some of them, there's an artist named Aldrovandi, or naturalist and artist, and all around sort of Renaissance person named Aldrovandi, who worked in the late 1500s in Italy. He made these dragons and these other mythical creatures that he actually sold to natural history museums and got into natural history museums. And they weren't real animals. They were composed of various animal parts, but they were these dragons he saw on his expeditions to places, and people bought them because they couldn't travel themselves, or they just believed him because they're like, hey, you're this naturalist, so we believe you. Fact checking then wasn't the same as it was now. So a lot of these hybrid creatures were made, some of these hybrid creatures were made to sort of get into, to kind of create some human notoriety and reputation. Some of them were made just for fun. The examples I have here, this is from Charles Waterton, who was a taxidermist that worked in the 1800s. This is clearly, this is clearly not a real animal. It's composed of, it looks like a little reptile, and with all of the little reptiles and some of the claws, which is cool. We've got the jackalope in the center. And this creature here that's made of just every creature on Earth, it seems like. This is an illustration that I actually found in an old taxidermy manual. And I just thought it was really incredible because it was part of an advertisement advertising taxidermy classes, which I think is just, it's so bizarre. And a lot of times, like, we think of this hybrid form of taxidermy as something very modern because a lot of modern artists do this, but it's actually really, really old. I think this form of taxidermy has been around for as long as traditional or naturalistic taxidermy has been around too. And there are also many other varied styles of taxidermy as well, especially now. So I've included works from myself and some friends of mine. So there are many kind of styles that kind of go between completely naturalistic and completely fantasy. And I think it's so exciting seeing new styles of taxidermy and seeing sort of new interpretations of taxidermy come around, because it really opens up so much unexplored potential to share like different stories and interpretations of nature and animals. And I think nature and animals are something we can all really, no matter what we come from and what we've experienced, nature and animals are things that we can find pleasantness in and things that we can bond over. So I think that's pretty cool. And a lot of people also interchangeably call naturalistic taxidermy traditional taxidermy, but I kind of like to say naturalistic versus fantasy because, the practices like anthropomorphic and gaff and other like sort of hybrid creatures and all of the sort of weird taxidermy has been documented as early as the regular taxidermy or as early as the naturalistic taxidermy. So I kind of think all of it falls into some tradition somewhere. So, I think that, the separation is really in the style and not so much in what is and isn't traditional, because all of it falls into someone's tradition somewhere. And then there are also the related art forms that a lot of people, when they think of taxidermy, they think of these things too, which are related art forms like bone cleaning, wet specimens, freeze dry or mummification, bug pinning, and just preservation. So I've included works from some other artists I admire. which are various variations of preservation, but taxidermy only really applies to the skin mounted over a form, but that isn't to exclude these forms of art. I think these forms of art that are related to taxidermy really come from that same passionate place of wanting to preserve and present and tell a story with nature, which is really, really cool. So, hold on a second. So the origins of taxidermy are really, really, varied too. So we have the ages before the internet. So preserved animals were sort of how people learned and shared information about animals. There were colonial expeditions that built cabinets of curiosity, which turned into museum and research collections. And though there were definitely, very problematic elements to a lot of these journeys, because going around the world and taking things from lands that you don't belong to and taking things and, harming people and animals just to kind of create a collection is very, we wouldn't do that now. But back then, that is sort of how we learned about the world. That's how information traveled. So there's sort of that duality and that very nuanced history of the origins of taxidermy too. So, and it's really hard to pin down what the first piece of taxidermy was, since practices of preservation were so widely varied. We think of mummification. That's one of the first documented ways of preserving animals. So we have mummies that were from Egypt and from South America, and a lot of the oldest surviving pieces of taxidermy are pretty interesting too. So we have a crocodile that dates back to the 1530s. It's hanging from the ceiling of a church in Italy. I really love birds. So one of the oldest surviving pieces of bird taxidermy is the Duchess of Richmond's pet parrot. That one dates to around the 1700s. And the 1800s were sort of the golden age of taxidermy as techniques and materials advanced. And there are a lot of historically documented taxidermists that you can read about. There are Carl Akeley is a really big name, Leon Prey, the Jonas Brothers, there's William Hornaday. There are so many taxidermists that have been really well documented that you can read about. I'm going to share some historic taxidermists that are often overlooked that tend to be sort of my favorites and sort of stories that I hope they're stories that inspired me, and so I hope those stories will inspire you too. So some historic taxidermists I like. We'll start with John Edmund Stone. So John Edmund Stone was born in Guyana. He lived as an enslaved person with Charles Edmund Stone, who was friends with Charles Waterton, whose work you saw earlier. And Charles Waterton taught John Edmund Stone how to do taxidermy. So after he was emancipated, he moved to Edinburgh and went on to make mounts for the Natural History Museum there. And he also taught taxidermy on the side, in addition to working as a taxidermist for the Natural History Museum. John Edmund Stone taught taxidermy on the side to curious university students. And one of his most influential students was none other than Charles Darwin, the evolution guy. So taxidermy and preservation were such a vital skill to Darwin's work, as in addition to many other specimens, he brought back all those finches. He went on an expedition to the Galapagos. He went on many expeditions. And without taxidermy, he wouldn't have been able to bring back specimens to not just collect the data, but to prove his theory of evolution and defend his theory of evolution. So not only did Darwin have a big impact on history, so did John Edmund Stone. And I think it's such a remarkable story how two people can meet and create such a big impact together with the information that they have exchanged. And any chance I get to talk about Edmund Stone, I do, because we all know Darwin's name, and I think we should really know Edmund Stone's name as well. Another of my favorite historic taxidermists is Martha Maxwell. She is an American taxidermist who worked in the mid-1800s, and she was known for her pretty eccentric personality, but she also had very realistic work. She was one of the people of her time who was creating these methods of not just mounting animals to look very realistic, but she was also putting animals into dioramas and displays that looked realistic too. So she was very particular about making an animal look very lifelike, not just in the execution of the animal, but in the execution of the habitat as well. And her work became so notorious that she was afforded a lot of opportunities that other women of the time didn't get. And one of those really big opportunities was doing a huge taxidermy installation at the Philadelphia Centennial Expo. And the title of it, this is where her personality comes in here, she titled that exhibit Women's Work. And that was in response to a lot of the misogynist attitudes of the day. And this exhibit, I mean, this is sort of a still from the exhibit, but this exhibit was really huge. There was a diorama that people could walk through. So it was this huge room full of Colorado wildlife. There were even water features in there. So there were like man-made rivers going through there. There were even live prairie dogs running around because she really wanted the effect of full immersion. So she was an artist with a vision, and she wasn't afraid to, you know, stand up for herself and kind of establish her place in this field that wasn't always the same as it is now. And she was one of very few women given this opportunity to speak at the time, and she was super accomplished in her work, so good that she couldn't be ignored. There's even an owl named after her, so that is another very interesting figure in taxidermy. Another woman in taxidermy that I really think has a cool story is Sarah Bowditch Lee. She was a naturalist and artist, and she was a writer too. She was a scientific writer. And one of her early works included Taxidermy, the Art of Collecting, Preparing, and Mounting Objects of Natural History. So this book is really cool because it's one of our first taxidermy manuals that spread around in around 1820. When it was released anonymously because women couldn't write at the time. They weren't allowed to publish papers, which is so bizarre. So she took jobs as a translator, as an illustrator, you know, to get her foot in the door, but she was really, really adamant about writing. And so she was like, I'm going to write this book. I'm just going to publish it anonymously. But in 1843, she finally made enough connections and met the right people to sort of say, hey, I'm tired of publishing this book anonymously, put my name on it and give me credit for it. And she did. And this book was, the way she wrote it was by meeting with other taxidermists and meeting with other preparators and naturalists to kind of compile a bunch of different techniques from all around Europe. So it's really, really, the content of the book was also very revolutionary too, because it was one of the first places a lot of different taxidermy techniques were put into place, and a lot of people could share, a lot of different techniques were shared among people that normally didn't have access to those techniques earlier. So it was an instrumental book in introducing and spreading the knowledge of taxidermy technique, and she fought like heck to publish it. Another really interesting figure in taxidermy is Carl Cotton, and he worked at the Field Museum. He was the first Black taxidermist to work at the Field Museum from the 1940s through the 70s. And there's a great exhibit on his work at the Field Museum if you happen to go to Chicago. If not, they made a lot of the resources available online too. And the way that this exhibit came about and the way that sort of the knowledge of his story really spread is thanks to Tori Lee, an exhibits developer at the Field Museum, and Rita Brooks, who also works over there. They came across a photo of him in the archives and ended up connecting with his family. And another thing, I'm a bird person, so he worked on a lot of really cool birds, including this shoebill stork here. So I'm really drawn to his story because he worked on so many cool birds, and just being one of the first of his time. That's really incredible too. So I'd highly recommend checking his story out as well. And another figure I really find interesting in taxidermy is Sinclair Clark. So he wasn't a taxidermist per se. He was a taxidermy tanner, and he lived and worked right here in New York City. And you can see a lot of his work at the American Museum of Natural History, at the Smithsonian, and a lot of other museums, because he created and perfected a lot of taxidermy tanning techniques. So a lot of times in taxidermy, we give all the credit to the taxidermist, the person who's mounting the skin on the form, but there's really a lot of different techniques that go into taxidermy. And oftentimes tanning, is one of the make or break processes in taxidermy. So tanning is turning that skin from raw gooey skin into soft, pliable leather that still retains the characteristics of the animal, is easy enough to work with and to stretch onto the form and to put onto the form. So he was a pioneer of a lot of different tanning techniques that are still used today by a lot of museums and a lot of the well-known a lot of the well-known taxidermists. He trained so many different people, and really perfected a lot of these tanning techniques. He was known for tanning very difficult and large mammal skins like elephants. If you think of an elephant, it has really tough skin, it has really thick skin, and it's a huge animal. So working with something like that is no small task. And I think even though he's not a taxidermist, I think that his work really should be known, and that the field of tanning itself should be really known too. So that's a bit of my favorite highlights from history. Now we'll go into the process of taxidermy and how it's made. So I'll also have some pictures of my studio in here too, so you can see where taxidermy is made as well. Every studio is going to look different. My studio is small in my home, so there will be photos of that, but there are also really huge taxidermy studios as well. So I want to kind of show you how much it can vary. So the first part, the other thing too, there will be some photos of skinned animals in here. There will be photos of carcasses and things like that. Hopefully that won't deter anybody, but I think you came to a taxidermy presentation, so I think you expected to see some meat a little bit, but it won't be too gory, at least not to me. So hopefully it'll be okay. So we'll start with the reference and the specimen. So before starting any piece of taxidermy, you gather your specimen and you gather reference. So I included here a photo of a reference of a bird measurement sheet. I work a lot on birds. So this isn't a sheet that I made. This is a sheet that you can buy from a taxidermy supplier. You can also download some of these for free online. But really, these are all the measurements I'm taking of the bird before it's skinned and after it's skinned too. So they're measurements of the body, measurements of the face, measurements of what the eye looks like. Every single part of an animal needs to be measured. The other part of gathering reference is live observation. So you also want to know what the bird looks like in life. So if you think back to that lion image from the beginning, the lion that looked really cartoony, the person who mounted that had probably never seen a lion until that skin landed on their workbench. So in order to create a piece of taxidermy that looks realistic, no matter what the end use is, whether it's in a fantasy piece or whether it's in a more realistic or a more naturalistic piece, you want the animal to look like the animal. So studying it in nature is really important. And that can be done through live observation. If that species is seen in your area, it can be done through photos and videos. We are really lucky in the age of the internet to have multiple ways to study different animals. And of course, animals are individuals, so the measurement sheet gives you a lot of information on the particular animal that you have in front of you. And next is skinning and cleaning. So I'm going to be showing you some photos of the skinning and cleaning process on a few different birds. This is a hummingbird I did. This is for a nature center. So this is something very, very small that has been skinned and cleaned, so you can see how thin the skin is here. But with taxidermy, again, it's skin mounted on a form. So you're taking everything out of the skin, all in one neat little package, hopefully. This is the skinning and cleaning process on a blue jay. So you can see that the skin is being removed over here. The center image shows the skin. While I'm cleaning some of it, I'm using some sawdust, but people can use different things like borax or talc, or all sorts of different powders are used to help clean the skin. So kind of like in an abrasive motion. And the third image is the skin after it's been washed. So it doesn't look as fluffy and nice as it was before. That's sort of part of the process of taxidermy, is where that skin transforms from a whole specimen to something that's kind of inverted and inside out to a shell of its former self. This is the area where I do skinning and processing. So it's just a clean area. This is my home studio, so it's a part of, a lot of people say it looks like a kitchen. This room was formerly a kitchen. It's not anymore. My kitchen is separate, but it's just a countertop where I have all of my tools laid out. Everything is cleanable. I keep some flowers there once in a while to kind of have it feel a little to feel a little more, to have some life in there and not just dead stuff. And you can see that it's just sink. The cabinets are where I keep all of my chemicals. This machine in the back here, this sort of half moon shaped machine, is a fleshing wheel, where it's just a motor with a wheel on it, where the wheel turns, and then I use that to help scrape fat off of larger specimens, larger birds, and some mammals too. And then the next thing after you skin an animal is to clean and flesh it. I hinted to that earlier with the blue jay, but these are some photos that show a little bit more of an extreme. Underneath the skin, whether it's a bird or a mammal or a reptile or anything, underneath the skin, there's a lot of muscle, there's a lot of tissue, there's a lot of fat. All of that needs to be cleaned away in order for a preservative to penetrate the skin. So this is a bit of before and after cleaning. It's not the same animal, but I wanted to really show photos of different animals and really show how extreme the difference can be with something clean and something not clean. And then after you've got your clean skin, there's the form and fitting. So you want to make your form based on the body. So I'm going to show you a few different forms here. This is a crane that I mounted, and this form was made of wood wool, which is, it looks like straw or hay, but it's actually shredded up aspen wood. And it's one of the oldest materials in taxidermy. And it's used for everything from a mouse to a moose. You can mount anything with wood wool. Of course, the techniques and supports are different, but it's a material that's taken and bound around an armature either made of wire or of wood. And then that is what the skin is mounted onto. For this crane, you can see that the head is not the real head, it's a replica skull. That's what I used for that crane. Here for this blue jay, I made a more modern body. This is made out of foam. And this is not like the styrofoam that you get, not like the white styrofoam, but it's a rigid urethane foam. And that's really what's most widely used now in modern taxidermy as a taxidermy form. You can buy taxidermy forms if you're working on very widely mounted species like deer, squirrels, and things like that. But most of the stuff I work on is really small or very unique, where there isn't a form, there isn't a readily made form for it. So I end up making a lot of my own forms. This is the carved foam form for a blue jay. The neck is made of bendable annealed wire, and it's wrapped in cotton. So, and it's got that S shape to mimic the shape of that blue jay's neck. These are another variety of taxidermy forms kind of through the ages, from very old photo to more modern photos now. So there are so many different ways to make taxidermy forms. So some of these old armatures are really, really cool to see. They're made of, I mean, this huge animal here is made of, it's got this metal structure with the wood supports underneath it, and you can see this person is, hammering it away at it. There are taxidermy forms like this one in the center here, where this is a bird that's actually completely hollow except for some wires. So this again is another Charles Waterton piece. He was one of these people that did these hollow taxidermy pieces, which are really, really incredible. So sometimes the taxidermy form is barely a form at all in some cases. And then there is this piece over here, which I think is really cool because it shows this heavily sculpted taxidermy piece with the skin being mounted over it. And a lot of times taxidermists, one of the other techniques they used to do to make an anatomically accurate form was to fully articulate a skeleton, build the muscles and the structure of it over the skeleton in clay, and basically recreate the animal and then mold that and then cast that. So that's likely what has been done here. Down here with the body and with this other form, this is another bird body that's wrapped out of wood wool. This one in the center here is a homemade molded body for a rat. So this was where the rat carcass was frozen, a silicone mold was made out of it, and then the foam, sorry, not a silicone mold, a fiberglass mold was made out of it, and then the foam was cast into that with some clay sculpted over it. And this last photo here is one of my favorites. It shows, it's a bisected piece. It was in a natural history museum in Arizona. They had a whole wall of these, which is really cool. But this is a deer where you can see the skin on the outside and you can see the old form on the inside. So this form was made with the real skull in there. These are lead ear liners. So for the shape of the ear, they held it up with lead. And the neck and the muscle tissue were rebuilt with wood wool, which is the same material used here. In this photo, it just looks a bit older because it's a bit more aged. And this is a form. Also, you've seen big forms, really small forms exist too. So this is for a hummingbird. I made a form the same way. This is made out of balsa wood. So really big taxidermy has a form in it, but so does really small taxidermy. All of it, and in all of it, the anatomy and stuff matters. So I think it's pretty interesting to show you that as well. And this is where the forms are made. So it's a sculpting bench. So there really is nothing too special about it. It's just a bench that is pretty dusty and messy because there's always some wood or foam or wood wool or something being sculpted on it. So any sculptor will know about the eternally dusty area, no matter how much shop back time you put in. So that's where all the sculpting and sanding happens. And then after you've sculpted and sanded and put your skin onto the form, there's finishing work that's involved in taxidermy. And this to me is one of the most fun parts because this is where you really bring the animal to life. So this is a pretty dramatic, it's probably a really dramatic example. This is for a toucan that I mounted. So here you can see on this slide over here has the face and the beak they've been cast from the real skull. This real skull was used for the real skull was used as a specimen by itself because toucans have really cool skulls, and who wouldn't want the skull in addition to the taxidermy? So I cast the skull and made a replica head for it. And here is a process of painting that replica head to look like the real thing. So it doesn't look like a plain white beak. If you had the real skull, you would also have to paint it too because the color fades after a while. So on a bird or on a mammal, on anything where it's preserved, the skin, all of that soft tissue, the beak, the feet, a lot of times the eyelids too, and the ears, all of that color has to come back. So it's painted. You can paint it using regular hand painting with acrylics or oil paints, which is a really old technique. A lot of modern techniques, people are using an airbrush, or they're using lacquer paints in an airbrush, or water-based paints in an airbrush. People also use powdered pigments as well, like pan pastels and stuff like that. So there's a number of as many painting techniques exist to create paintings. That's how many techniques there are to repaint and recolor taxidermy. And these are some finished pieces. So we remember the blue jay and the toucan and the hummingbird from before. This is them now. And this hummingbird here, I put a note because it's a male, it's in a nest, and I know that's not correct, but that's how the client wanted it. And that is a video that could actually play, so you can see how that looks. So really it goes from this very lifeless shell into an animal, which I find the most rewarding part of the process. So this is a bit of a refresher on the process. So we start from the raw specimen to the specimen being skinned and cleaned, to it being sculpted, to it being sculpted some more and looking kind of rough, to a finished piece that looks like the animal. So it really is such taxidermy. The taxidermy process itself is really such a journey, just technically, and that's beyond anything else that it does with the storytelling. So another part of the taxidermy process is, of course, freezers and specimen storage. So a lot of times people ask me, where do you put all of the animals? Because you're not working on them immediately, which is right. I don't work on everything as soon as I get it because it's just not practical too. So I store it in a freezer. And the freezer is separate from my food freezer. It's a separate, this is the chest freezer that I have. At the moment, I have 3 freezers. I'm hoping to cut down to 2 because, minimizing. So specimens are stored in the freezer. A lot of times to kind of make sure that they're not damaged, I wrap them up. With birds, I actually wrap them in old stockings. This is a whole flamingo that's in a stocking. It's just the skin. So it's wrapped in a stocking because it helps compress the feathers. And then I'll wrap plastic around this. usually old grocery bags or old plastic wrap. I reuse a lot of that stuff because for storing deceased creatures, there's no need for it to be brand new. And I like to recycle and reuse, and a lot of the stuff is reusable. So that is how specimens are stored. Some people use those bags, like vacuum bags, to take the air out of specimens. I'd like to not use those because I find that they can cause freezer burn sometimes. As far as how long a specimen can be stored, it can be stored. I've worked on specimens that were in a freezer for 20 and 30 years. So they can be, something can be stored for a very long time. It just might get freezer burned, or there might be damage with freezer burn sometimes, or it can get dried out. So you need to rehydrate it. But a specimen can be stored. Ideally, it can be stored indefinitely, but that doesn't mean it will be easy to work on once it's thawed out. There's also tools and materials that, there's a storage area for that. And a lot of the tools and materials for taxidermy are tools and materials used in other areas. So there are sculpting tools. There are a lot of tools that I will get at a hardware store. I think one of the coolest things about taxidermy is that it reuses and repurposes tools from other practices, because it combines so many other practices together. So if you did like a sort of scavenger hunt of different tools here, you'd probably find a tool from every single type of sculpting or hardware application. And this is the clean room. This is where I'm talking to you from now. So this is my studio where I don't do all the messy stuff. This is where I do all the painting and all the finishing, and where I store everything, because it's a dust-free room. It's a very clean and climate-controlled place, and that is where taxidermy ideally should be stored, so that it doesn't get dirty, and so that all of the hard work that someone put into it stays intact. So any of the grooming, detail, and finishing work is done up here, or in there, and in here, which is the same place. And that is hopefully has shown you the process of taxidermy too. And I'm going to close out with the last section of why taxidermy is important, why it's important to me, and why I think it's important to keep around and important for new people to get into and to pursue. So one of the big reasons is curiosity. So though we have advanced a ton since the 1800s, when taxidermy had its golden age, that's a really good thing. We've advanced so much. But taxidermy has also gone in and out of taste and favor during that time. But now more than ever, there's a huge resurgence in interest in people getting outdoors, and especially with people seeking out experiences that involve nature, that involve touching something, that involve something that isn't digital, that involves sort of, feeling the grass under your feet, or feeling the sun on your face, or feeling the cold wind on your face, whatever it is, just getting out there and feeling something visceral. And taxidermy puts you up close and personal with the wonders of anatomy, with an animal, in a way that no other experience does, because you're seeing the animal inside and out. And no matter how many times I have done taxidermy, I still can't believe how delicate some creatures are, and how, like with a creature like the hummingbird, for example, that every ingredient for its life was contained in this package the size of a penny. I mean, there is no other, we can feel these concepts and kind of understand them when they're abstract and when they're written, or when they're spoken, or when they're heard, but seeing it face to face and feeling that with your hands, and seeing it with your eyes, and experiencing it with your senses, that is just so electric to me. And I think that there's no other way to really get close to that, aside from, or there are many ways to get close to that, but getting close to that through the art of taxidermy is such a special experience. And I think it kind of satisfies our curiosity and piques our curiosity in ways that other art forms don't always do. Another huge aspect of taxidermy is public engagement and the access to nature too. So I grew up in a city, and so a lot of my access to nature came from museums and seeing taxidermy dioramas. In a museum setting, the public can engage with the stories that dioramas tell. They can appreciate the skill and the artistry of taxidermy by seeing, by kind of being immersed in this whole other environment. The other thing too is you kind of get a glimpse into the quirks of the different people who might have made the taxidermy. So one diorama might be made by one person, another might be made by someone else. You can kind of see the quirks of the different makers and kind of get a clue into the history of the pieces and the people behind the pieces themselves, which I think is so interesting and so special, and sort of this like next layer of engaging with a piece of taxidermy. And with taxidermy animals, you know, they capture something that a photo or video can't really, that the photo or video can't really get. You kind of get the full scale and the presence of an animal, and you kind of feel like the gravity of the animal too. And, you know, in those sort of experiences and engaging with an animal in that way kind of has us, it kind of piques certain conversations. It kind of piques our interest. I know it piqued my interest when, you know, when I saw a zebra for the first time. You know, it wasn't, I haven't seen a zebra in its natural habitat. The first time I saw a zebra was in a museum, and it was, you know, it was incredible. I was like, wow, it's a lot bigger, and it doesn't look like a cartoon that I see on TV. You know, it's a lot bigger than I thought it would be. And although, you know, although it's not alive, it got me very close to the animal in a way that nothing else really did. And I think it also gives a lot of gravity to words like habitat loss and, you know, and wildlife protection, because you get close to the animals that you want to protect. The other part of taxidermy, which is really fun, is artistic value. So artistically, you know, even if you're seeing taxidermy as home decor and not as a piece in a museum, you're usually supporting, most taxidermists are very small businesses. There is no Amazon of taxidermy, which is great. There should never be an Amazon of taxidermy. So a lot of times you're supporting a local artist when you're supporting a taxidermist. And especially now with all the transparency around sustainability and sourcing, taxidermy is usually a sustainably made product. And art made about animals, even if it's not in a museum, even if it's not depicting a grand scene from a far off place in the world, any art about animals, when we get close to it, I think it kind of brings awareness about the animal, and it gives us an appreciation for that animal, and hopefully keeps us, you know, it's a daily reminder to keep us thinking about conserving animals and keeping them, you know, living in a way that helps protect them. And I think a lot of exciting conversations happen with taxidermy outside of the museum setting. I think that there are a lot of really cool and exciting conversations that happen around art, and it kind of gets people thinking about animals in a different way. And another huge reason for keeping taxidermy around is extinction. So it would be far more preferable if animals did not go extinct. But when they do, taxidermy preserves their forms for studies, it preserves their forms for proof that these animals existed, and for appreciation. And it's really haunting getting close to an animal that's been extinct. I've had the real luck of working on a passenger pigeon, which you see here. The other photo is of my mentor, George Dante, working on Lonesome George, which is one of the last Galapagos tortoises. So it's really haunting to get close to these animals who are the last of their kind, or one of the last of their kind. And it's just so emotional. It's really, really, it's a really haunting reminder to protect animals and to make sure that extinction doesn't repeat itself. And then another really great reason to keep taxidermy around is the cultural value. So I was hinting to it earlier with the talking about the public engagement with taxidermy and kind of finding the quirks of seeing the different quirks of different mounts and stuff made by different artists. But they also, taxidermy also, because it's gone in and out of favor so much, it really carries the attitudes of the people who made those pieces. And I think even seeing an old mount in a different light, seeing something in a different context, it can really change how we see things. So a lot of times you might look at a piece of taxidermy and say, oh, this makes me feel one way. And 10 years later, you might look at it and discover something new about it. And I think that creates a different sort of value for that animal as our perspectives and everything change. Taxidermy animals also carry histories. Taxidermy is a way of telling stories, and as different generations get into taxidermy, they don't just tell their own stories, but they kind of create new stories that can be told in different ways to different people. And another really big part, and the part I'll sort of end with taxidermy, is death positivity. So taxidermy is made from a deceased animal, and a lot of people look at that as something very morbid. They look at that as something really, really sad. They kind of, our culture now especially, sanitizes and distances itself from death in a way that that really isn't healthy, I don't think. But I think these conversations and getting close to these animals isn't just about conservation, but it's also just about placing that value on life, which I think is a bigger theme than, it's a bigger theme in improving our world. So I think one of the best things that taxidermy does is getting us close to something that was living. And though most modern attitudes kind of want us to take away from it, or kind of want us to stay away from that, I think contemplating our own mortality and contemplating the mortality of these animals helps us better think of larger decisions of how we live and how we move through the world, and what is meaningful and what gives us a sense of purpose. So, whenever I look at taxidermy, every day I work on it, I know that this animal is going to outlive me, and I think of what I'm going to leave behind. So no matter if your interest is in art or science or conservation, I think that question of what am I going to leave behind is one of the best questions that anyone can really ask themselves as they move through the world. And that is that is the last kind of thought I will leave you with about taxidermy. And I guess we'll open it up for some Q&A if people have questions.
Thank you so much, Divya. I mean, I have questions. I'm sure y'all have questions too. You can put them in the chat. You can unmute yourself. But I guess, you know what, I'm going to start with one of my questions. So Divya, you mentioned early experiences with taxidermy and museums. Did you always know that this was a field you wanted to get into? I mean, how did you get into taxidermy?
That's a good question. So I never thought it was a field I would get into. To be like, when I saw it, I just thought it was something, I thought it was something that's very niche, and it still is very niche. There's not like, it's not like being a dentist or something where there's a lot of dentists, or a doctor or something like that. So taxidermy is very niche, but I got into it mainly as a hobby. And it was something that I collected. I would go, as a kid, I would collect like little rocks and seashells and stuff like that. One day I found a lizard this is when I was like 7 or 8. I found a lizard that had passed on in our backyard, and I took that. It was a little anole, because I grew up in Miami, so we had these tiny little anoles. So I took that lizard and put it with my rocks and seashells, and then my mom found it and was like, you can't keep an animal like this. Animals have to be preserved in a different way than your dried plants and rocks and shells and stuff. And that kind of sparked my interest in what taxidermy is. And along with, going to the museums and seeing these animals, and, I was the kid that would always ask the docents or whoever was at the museum, I was like, is that animal dead? And they were like, oh my God, this kid wanted to ask me this question. They're like, why did you ask? But one day I found someone who said, yeah, it's a dead animal. This is how it was made. And that just blew my mind. I was like, wow, someone made this. And, this animal has outlived the person who made it. It's going to outlive me, hopefully. It's going to outlive, these animals are going to outlive all of us and kind of continue to tell their stories in new and exciting and different ways. So that is, that sparked the interest. As far as like when I started doing taxidermy, when I moved to New York, and when I finally had my own place, I sort of picked it up as a hobby and started collecting more stuff, whether it was from antique stores and things like that. And I've had my business for about 7 years. It's how long I've had my business. As far as how long I've been doing it as a hobby, probably over 10 years. So yeah, so it was a bit of a long journey.
Thank you. Any other questions in the room?
Yeah, I see some in the chat. What is the educational background of someone in taxidermy? Which is a pretty good question. So it really varies. So there used to be, like in the 1800s, and when it was taxidermy's golden age, it used to be very much an apprenticeship type of system where someone would learn from someone else who did it. And it was very much tied to being a naturalist and very much tied to being, being in the sciences and having that artistic background as well. Nowadays, there are taxidermists from every background. So I went to school for fashion design, and that has nothing to do with taxidermy, but I learned art, and I learned a lot of handicraft through that. And so the way I learned taxidermy was going to different state shows and competitions and things like that, to find different taxidermy associations and go and learn from people there. So I pretty much learned one-on-one. I also learned through books and videos and being self-taught. And most taxidermists now are a combination of those things, of being self-taught, of getting one-on-one instruction, and of just experimenting on their own. There are taxidermy schools out there, but I also like to stress that it's not fully necessary to go to a taxidermy school to try taxidermy. Although if it's something you're thinking about as a career, I would say to get as many different experiences in taxidermy as you can, and then to go from there and kind of figure out which method of learning you like best and which method of practice you like best as well.
Thank you. I see another one in the chat from Diane. The beak colors. Don't the beaks, toucan, retain color?
They do not. No, they fade pretty after death. All of the color of everything fades because there's no more life. So with the skin and stuff, there's no blood rushing through the veins. With the beak, none of those structures retain their color. They fade. They might not fade immediately, but by the time they get to a taxidermist, they'll fade. And you can even see on older mounts where there wasn't finishing work done, you'll see the colors of beaks and stuff as very faded. And a lot of times with color too, especially with bird beak color and bird feet color, really any color of anything, like mammals' ears and things like that, there's so much variation as well. So in nature, some of these colors, like when I was painting that toucan, I was looking at some photos of toucans, and I was like, these look neon almost, even the ones that weren't photoshopped. Like some of these colors look so bright, they look almost fake. And I worked on chickens sometimes too, where the feet look almost fake, and chickens are really easy to access. So I contacted some people in my neighborhood who keep hens, and I looked at their chickens, and I was like, yeah, their feet look almost fake. So sometimes the colors in nature are a lot brighter than what we have what we have seen like in our head. And especially if you look at a lot of taxidermy, a lot of the colors are really subdued. And not to say that it's wrong, but there's so much variation in the color that a lot of times we don't realize, like, oh wow, like I painted this wrong, or oh wow, like this is a lot brighter than it seems. But yeah.
You have a couple more in the chat.
Sure.
From Kathy, we have, how would one engage a taxidermist to create an item for the home?
It would depend on the taxidermist. So I would say you can research different taxidermists who have different specialties. So a lot of times people, like, I'll just speak from my own experience, but if people message me and they're like, I would like a deer, I usually refer them to someone else because I specialize in birds. So I would say the first thing would be to find someone who specializes in the thing you want for your home, whether it's a large deer or a small bird or, a cool snake or whatever animal you're looking for your home. Find someone who specializes in that, and then email them or call them or message them, telling them what you're looking for, and they'll usually be willing to work with you based on what you're asking. So I would also say another expectation to have with taxidermy is that it takes a long time. So every taxidermist has a different way of working, but it's usually because it's such a time-consuming process and no one is really working on only one thing at a time. They're usually working on multiple items at a time. So to have the expectation that it'll probably take a few months to get a piece made, especially if it's custom. But yeah, I hope that answers that question.
And then we have one from Amanda in the chat, and then Angel is raising her hand. So Amanda's question is, how is the shape? Oh, we got another one from Kathy. How is the shape of the skin retained in the pieces with more minimal mounts, such as the one that was basically a wire armature?
That's a really good question. So I haven't done anything that's just the wire armature in that way. So from what I understand of that technique, the wire armature is made, and it's done with, I think Charles Waterston did that with a lot of birds and a lot of thin-skinned animals. So I think he made that wire armature and just groomed it until, and like poked the skin around and moved that skin into place and just kept picking at it until the skin dried in that shape. So that's my understanding of that technique, is that he made that wire armature to just stretch the skin at strategic points and then pinned and prodded and poked it until it dried into the right shape, which I think is so, it's a very fascinating process. I've never tried it. I've never had a specimen I wanted to try it on, but I hope to try that technique someday. So that's my understanding of it. It could be wrong, but I know those ones are hollow. For other taxidermy where the form is more filled out, that has the more solid and more opaque kind of form. With that too, like the skin has to be moved around and put into the right place. And you know, the bird or mammal or anything is really sort of groomed into place and the skin kind of put into the right place, and then it dries that way. So there's usually some adjustment that has to be made while the skin dries, because you want to control the shrinkage or anything like that. You want to make sure it doesn't shrink, but you know, when something goes from wet to dry, it shrinks a little bit. So you're really, taxidermy is also a game of controlling and playing with shrinkage.
Thanks. And Angel, what's your question?
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. It's so amazing. I'm so excited to hear about all of this. I have lots of questions, but specifically, I guess to start with, I'm wondering about the fact that like lots of species of animals, especially birds and migrating birds, are protected, and like it's totally illegal to even have like certain feathers in your possession.
Yeah.
From like a large variety of birds. And I was wondering if you have a permit or how you went about that, and if you were just like, oh, I'm a taxidermist and that was enough, or how.
No, it's not enough.
I'm sure it's not. I'm just curious.
So a lot of all the protected birds you saw were done for museums or for nature centers or for any accredited institution. So the blue jay, the hummingbird, the owls, all of those, like a normal, like, you know, a regular taxidermist, or not even, no one can have those species. But because I have a federal migratory bird permit, and the museum, the most important part, the museum, the nature center, the educational institution, they commissioned me to make those pieces. That's the only reason I can have them. So that's a really good question, because a lot of people will say, well, I found this cardinal, it crashed into a window, can you mount it for me? And my answer is always no, unless you're a museum or a nature center or an educational institution that's using this piece and has the permits to keep that bird. So on my website, I actually have a link to all of the different laws that apply to taxidermy. But yeah, most birds are protected. The only wild birds that you can pick up are the English sparrow, the European starling, and pigeon. And that's the rock dove, our gray New York City pigeon. Those are the only ones that an individual can pick up. So any of the protected birds that I post, any of the ones that you saw here, those are all done for educational institutions. And a lot of times people, you know, they'll find birds too, like especially now during migration, a lot of people message me about, I found this dead bird, what should I do with it? The Audubon Society, New York City Audubon is really good about advocating for various bird protections, but one of the great tools they have, which is used all over the nation, is dBird. So if you find a dead bird, report it on dBird. They'll use that data to help enforce different policies. Like we have our Bird Safe Buildings Act in New York, which is done pretty recently. I think it was 2020, which is really amazing. They did that through dBird and through the data they collected through Project Safe Flight. So definitely report dead birds to dBird if you find them. And if they're in really good condition, you can always contact the American Museum of Natural History, New York City Audubon, or any museum that has a natural history collection, or any educational group that has a natural history collection, an ornithology college. you can contact these groups and see if they're accepting specimens and if they'll take the specimen from you. So that way the specimen is preserved and it's in the hands of someone who's supposed to have it. And that way you're not, that way you're finding a place for that. And sometimes they might not, sometimes institutions aren't accepting specimens because their freezers might be full. So that's, that's a reality too. So if you want to take photos of it, you can, it's completely fine to take photos of it, but it's not fine to hold that piece. And another thing related to that too is a lot of times, like I'll get inquiries for rentals as well. And after I posted a photo of this blue jay, there's a photographer that was like, can I rent that photo, can I rent that blue jay for a photo? That's not legal for me to do either. So, I mean, I think there is probably a different provision made if the museum directly wanted to work with someone that wanted to photograph that specimen that was an individual. But even any of that stuff, like if the only exchange that I can have is that museum paying me to mount the specimen, and that's it, and returning that specimen to them. And even within my studio, there's a tag on it that says who it's for, what their permit number is, and all of that, because if Fish and Wildlife's knock on my door, they should be able to see that this is for this person. So yeah, or this is for this client. So yeah, really good question.
Thank you. And then we have one more from Kathy, and then I think Diane will be our last. So from Kathy, with your interest in birds, do you bird watch on a regular basis?
I try to, yeah, I try to. And I usually volunteer for different bird related things. So over the summer, I was volunteering for the New York City Plover Project because I love the beach, love birding, and what a great way to combine the two. Right now I'm volunteering with Project Safe Flight, which is such an incredible effort by New York City Audubon. And it's all about monitoring the window collisions that happen during migration. So if anyone's into those things, there's that. I highly recommend those. But yeah, I love birding, but I love doing anything bird related. Yeah.
And Diane, what's your question?
I guess this was hard to describe, but I had a question about one time when I was working in a museum. I had a Native American woman who I worked with a lot, and she was accepting of the fact that we had taxidermy on the wall, but she couldn't look at it because she felt it was religiously, she didn't want to, she sees these creatures as kinfolk, more like that. And the way she expressed it, I guess, was like, she just couldn't look at it because to her it would be like having a person's head on the wall. So that sort of connection to death and how religious, did you ever come across that with faith questions like that?
Yeah, and I think that relationship to death is so personal, and it can vary. There's so many variations to it. There's personal, there's personal views, there's cultural views, there's so much to it. So I know taxidermy isn't for everyone, and that's okay. I think that is part of the beauty of the world, is that everyone has a different connection to animals, different connections to death, and all of that. So I think that's it's important. I think it's important to respect that. And there's also, the question also comes up to me too, is a lot of antique taxidermy, a lot of old taxidermy was made in a way that I would never condone and collected under conditions that, were very toxic and harmful and awful. But for me, like seeing those old pieces, I don't want those old pieces to go away because there's still, that animal is still an animal. And for me, like seeing that animal be destroyed is more heartbreaking than kind of learning sort of the complex lessons that are tied up in it. But I know that's going to be something very different for, I know it's going to be something very different for everyone. So I think that, those conversations are always really good opportunities for us to get to know each other beyond just through those animals. So
Thank you.
Thank you so much for bringing that up.
Thank you. And thank you, Divya. I'm putting your website in the chat for everyone to visit.
Oh yeah.
Follow your work.
Oh, cool.
And
Amanda is also a Plover Project volunteer. That's awesome. Cool. Awesome.
Thank you so much for this incredible presentation. I mean, I honestly, we could probably we could take this Q&A even further, I'm sure. So you have definitely piqued our curiosity. And I just want to make a note that this program today is connected to our current exhibition, Magic Cicada, which is an incredible installation by Jennifer Angus. And in that immersive environment of wonder created with hundreds, thousands of preserved insects, is a lot of the museum's taxidermy and some of our wet collection too. So if you've not seen Magic Cicada, definitely make your way to the museum Friday through Sunday, 11 to 5. And I also want to plug next weekend's in-person program with Chef Joseph Yoon of Brooklyn Bugs. He also contributed to Jennifer Angus's exhibition Magic Cicada. So it will be an artist talk, a chef's talk, and we'll really look at the way the Brood 10 cicada changed his life. So thank you so much, Divya. This was incredible. Thank you to everyone and your amazing questions. And I'm just going to Google taxidermy now for the next hour.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. This is awesome. And I hope to try and catch, I think I might be away, but I hope to try and catch Joseph if it's recorded online or something. That sounds awesome.
Definitely will be. Thank you. And this is also recorded and will go on our YouTube. So thank you, everyone.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Yeah, thank you, Divya.
Thanks.